Coming up on New Day at Arirang, South Korea forecasting an additional 1,200 new cases of COVID-19 on Tuesday. Also, with the vaccination rate easily topping 70%, South Korea unveils its blueprint for living with COVID. A virtual South Korea-ASEAN summit starts in the coming hours. The theme, we care, we prepare, we prosper. The agenda largely driven by efforts to recover from the pandemic. Plus, the United States is urging China to use its considerable sway to play a bigger role in efforts to breathe fresh life into stalled talks over North Korea's denuclearization. Hello and welcome to this Tuesday edition of New Day at Arirang. I'm Mark Broom. It's 8 a.m. Korea time on October 26th here in Seoul, South Korea.
And I'm Kim Mo-gan. As usual, we have a packed show for you over the next hour. We'll be taking a look at the big news stories of the day and get expert insights on the issues facing Korea and the world.
That's right, and we are going to start with South Korea's efforts to get life somewhat back to normal after almost 2 years of living under the spectre of the COVID-19 pandemic, with more than 70% of South Korea's population now fully vaccinated. Local authorities have been laying out a blueprint for what this post-COVID normal might look like.
There are expected to be numerous changes, and while many people in South Korea welcome the transition, others are warning it may be too early to start letting the nation's guard down against the virus. Our Kim Hyun-sing has our top story.
The Living with COVID-19 plan, unveiled by South Korea's health authorities on Monday, involves 3 phases and stretches into next January. The first phase is going to start by easing restrictions on small and local businesses. The next will allow for larger events. The third and final stage will be to lift caps on all social gatherings. But before moving on to each stage, there's going to be a 6-week period where health officials look at the number of critical cases, deaths, and the scale of the outbreak to determine whether or not it's appropriate to move on to the next stage. If all goes as planned, the country might see an end to all restrictions by late January. The first stage will start next Monday and will start by raising the limit on social gatherings to 10 people. At restaurants and cafes, however, parties of 10 have to include at least 4 people who are fully vaccinated. Authorities will also lift the 10 p.m. curfew for cafes and restaurants. There will be no cap on operation hours for singing rooms, gyms, and public baths either. But customers of those establishments will need to show proof of full vaccination or a negative PCR test to enter. Entertainment facilities like nightclubs still have to close at midnight, on top of asking for vaccine passes. While many business owners were happy about the changes, some were divided about the fairness of the new rules.
Cafes and restaurant owners are welcoming the end of limits on their business hours, but some people running entertainment facilities aren't thrilled about the midnight limit.
A lot of people who run singing rooms and gyms say the vaccine pass isn't fair. Why can't only fully vaccinated people use our establishments when pubs can have people who are unvaccinated?
Health experts are also concerned about a potential surge in infections that this plan may bring. But they still say that this is a step in the right direction. And to make living with COVID-19 sustainable for medical staff, mild cases of the virus will now be treated at home.
It's true that this approach could be somewhat riskier, but if there's a surge in cases, we will not be able to handle it with our current system.
He says that increased at-home recovery is a critical element needed before the country heads into living with COVID-19. Kim Hyun-sing, Arirang News.
And staying with the coronavirus situation in South Korea, as we heard during Hyun-sing's report, the nation is slowly transitioning into the first phase of living with COVID-19, joining other countries that have already started enjoying pre-pandemic lives.
For more on this and other COVID-19 related updates, joining us in the studio is our reporter, Che Min-jung. Min-jung, thanks for joining us again.
Good morning.
So let's start with the forecast for Tuesday. The official numbers come out at around 9:30 a.m. every day, Korea time. However, what we know so far, what are the estimates looking like?
Well, so from from midnight to 9 p.m. last night, South Korean health authorities confirmed close to 1,200 cases. So we're expecting to see numbers hovering above the 1,200 range on Tuesday. The numbers are a little higher than the day before, but this increase is likely due to the weekend effect, as we tend to see cases increasing as we go further into the week.
Yeah, you will give us an update on the exact details later, right?
Right.
So we heard with our Yunsing that the government released a blueprint of their gradual return to normal life. Can you give us a recap?
Right, so starting November 1st, South Korea will be under the first phase of 3. So for around a month and a half, restrictions on operating hours for almost all businesses will be lifted. This means restaurants and cafes can operate 24 hours a day from then. But there are still limits in place for high-risk facilities like bars and nightclubs. They will have to close at midnight, and a vaccine pass indicating that people have been fully vaccinated will be required for entry into these facilities as well. Another big change is the number of people allowed for social gatherings. A maximum of 10 people can gather regardless of the number of people vaccinated, but in restaurants and cafes, no more than 4 unvaccinated people are allowed. The finalized details will be announced on Friday.
Right, so we now know that South Korea is gradually going to transition back to normal from November 1st, but what about other countries?
So right now, many people are keeping a close eye on Portugal. The country recently lifted many of its COVID-19 restrictions in a move to return to normality. Nightlife entertainment facilities reopened, and limits on operation hours were lifted for businesses as well. And they've also seen thousands of soccer fans enjoying games, with a 30% capacity limit on sports stadiums now lifted. Despite the easing of restrictions, the country did not see a surge. Experts say this is mainly due to its high vaccination rates, as nearly 87% of the population have been fully vaccinated. Restrictions are also being lifted in Japan as well, where cases are starting to drop. People in Tokyo may now drink and eat in restaurants and bars without time constraints. And just until last week, eateries had to close early and could not serve alcohol past 8 p.m. But it's important to remember that cases will possibly hike in South Korea once it begins to ease restrictions. Countries that lifted them relatively earlier than the rest of the world, like the UK and Singapore, are seeing a fresh surge in cases.
So Minjung, alongside Portugal, how is the vaccination drive going worldwide?
Well, the WHO chief says vaccinating 40% of each country's population will be possible by the end of the year. Though he did stress vaccine inequity in regards to less developed countries, as many have still not yet received first doses. A fair distribution seems important at this point to get the whole world back to normal.
Okay, thank you, Minjung, for your report. I will talk to you again in our noon newscast.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Now, in other news, stressing there's no time to lose, the UN's weather agency says the buildup of greenhouse gas in the atmosphere reached a new high in 2020.
The agency's report added it came despite the pandemic-related lockdowns that led to a temporary reduction in emissions. Kim Hyo-sun with more.
The World Meteorological Organization warns that greenhouse gas concentrations hit a record high last year, increasing at a faster rate than the annual average for the past decade. In a report released by the agency Monday, the WMO said the results come despite a temporary reduction in emissions during COVID-19-induced lockdowns. It explained that concentrations of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere reached a new high of 413.2 parts per million in 2020. This, the report said, was 149% higher than levels recorded before industrialization. It added that methane and nitrous oxide levels were also at record highs at 262 and 123% respectively of levels seen in 1750 before the Industrial Revolution. The Geneva-based agency says the world needs to act now.
And we have to start dealing with the emissions already during this decade. We cannot wait, otherwise we will lose the Paris targets, and we would suffer for the coming hundreds or even thousands of years because of high level of carbon dioxide which is the most important part of that.
The organization also pointed to a new cause for concern. It said parts of the Amazon rainforest have gone from being so-called carbon sinks that suck the gas from the air to a source of CO2, mainly because of deforestation and reduced human populations in the region. Kim Yo-sun, Arirang News.
Slashing carbon emissions isn't the only requirement to slow global warming. Experts say there are other greenhouse gases emissions that must also be reduced, such as methane. To that end, South Korea is joining the Global Methane Pledge, which is dedicated to cutting such emissions. Kim Sang-min reports.
South Korea is joining the global commitment to cut methane emissions by signing up to the Global Methane Pledge. According to the Trade Ministry on Monday, the US and EU-led initiative aims to cut global methane emissions by at least 30% in the coming decade, and South Korea plans to cut its emissions by the same amount. Methane is one of the 6 greenhouse gases designated by the Kyoto Protocol and is responsible for around a third of all global warming. It also accounts for around half of the 1 degree Celsius net rise in the global average temperature since the pre-industrial era. In 2018, South Korea emitted some 28 million tons of methane, mainly in the agriculture, waste, and energy sectors. By 2030, the country aims to cut that down to 19.7 million tons. The agriculture sector accounts for 43% of South Korea's total emissions, and that largely comes from rice cropping and livestock excretions. The government plans to improve water in rice paddies and better treat animal waste. The waste sector, which takes up 1/3 of emissions, will focus on reducing food waste as well as reinforcing landfill facilities. The last 22%, coming from energy sector, will be reduced through improving energy efficiency and expanding the use of green energy. The government says the pledge complements its plans to make the country carbon neutral by 2050. Kim Sang-min, Arirang News.
Now we are going to cross over to our ASEAN for global insight and an in-depth look at important developments in world affairs.
Thanks very much, Mark. It is indeed time for Global Insight, where we connect to experts from around the world to hear their views on issues making headlines. Now, while the world looks to renewables and sustainable sources to power the future, it's facing a protracted energy crunch. Power shortages are turning off streetlights and halting conveyor belts in China and Europe. And as global demand for energy outruns coal supplies, electricity costs have spiked and natural gas prices have hit all-time highs. As the global economy recovers and world leaders prepare to gather for the UN Climate Change Conference beginning over the weekend, the sudden energy crisis is hitting already stressed supply chains and raising questions over the world's preparedness for a green transition. We discuss the situation and where the world is headed with Eswar Prasad, Tulani Senior Professor of Trade Policy at Cornell University. He is also a Senior Fellow at the Brookings Institution and the author of The Future of Money, How the Digital Revolution is Transforming Currencies and Finance. Welcome to the programme, Professor.
It's my pleasure, thank you.
And while the current energy crisis really, it's demonstrating just how hard it is for countries to go carbon neutral. Do you think this is just the first of more crises to come, and do you see the shortage lasting throughout the winter?
So right now we have this interesting combination of demand in certain parts of major economies. In China, we have a slowdown. In the US, the economy is not doing so well, but Chinese consumers, US consumers, and consumers around the world do seem to be propping up their economies, and that increase in demand translates into an increase in the need for fuel and for energy more broadly. And at the same time that we are seeing this spurt in demand, we are seeing supply constraints beginning to act up as bottlenecks in terms of transportation and logistics, but also in terms of generating the sort of supply that is needed to match this demand. So this confluence of factors, I think, is going to stay with us for a while, especially as we head into winter in the Northern Hemisphere.
Right, and the crisis seems to be spreading beyond Europe and China. And of course, this crisis didn't happen overnight. Why weren't governments, though, why weren't they able to anticipate this kind of supply shock?
I think the difficulty that governments face is that they're trying to move towards more carbon neutral economies, and they are becoming more cognizant of the environmental costs of their growth models. But I think their intentions to try to switch their economies away from energy dependence is not quite matching up with the reality on the ground, especially as their economies recover from the shock of the COVID-19 pandemic. So on the supply side, the transition is going relatively slowly, while on the demand side, we're continuing to see very significant strength.
And of course, one of the hardest hit countries is China, and it's really hitting production hard. There's power shortages. How acutely will this energy shortage affect the country's GDP growth this year?
China is already facing weak growth momentum because they're trying to do many things at the same time. They're trying to reduce the amount of speculation in the property markets, and the property sector has traditionally been a key driver of growth in China. In addition, they're trying to prevent new debt accumulation as part of the deleveraging campaign that is trying to make sure that companies, including real estate developers, don't take on too much debt. On top of that, the energy shortage is crimping industrial growth, and certainly if this persists for much longer, it's going to put a significant dent in China's growth. And given that China is the world's second largest economy and has been a key driver of growth during the recovery from the coronavirus pandemic, that will certainly put a dent in global growth as well.
And of course, as you mentioned, we're hearing more and more about this debt problem that China seems to have with its property developers unable to meet their dollar payments. How much trouble do you think the Chinese economy is in right now? I mean, given this energy shortage, and as you said, this is all on top of its spiraling housing crisis as well.
Now, there is a concern that the potential default by one of China's biggest property developers, Evergrande, might have implications not just for the property sector, but also for financial markets and therefore for the real economy. The Chinese government seems to be betting that the problem can be contained, that even if Evergrande were to default, and even if that were to spill over to a few other property developers, there will not be systemic financial risks that are brought forward by this outcome. But certainly, even in the best case scenario, it's going to put a significant crimp on growth because the property sector, again, is a key driver of China's growth. And this is going to create a lot of uncertainty, not just in the property markets, but also in financial markets more broadly. But the government seems determined to stick with its campaign of deleveraging, putting the squeeze on property speculation, and more importantly, introducing some market discipline to financial markets. That is to tell financial markets that if you investors need to invest in weak property development, the problem is yours, not the government's.
And well, with the Factory of the World being in this rather sticky situation, coupled with the supply chain crisis, what would a protracted power shortage and the slowdown in China's output mean for global economic recovery?
Now, China has been an important driver of global demand as well. In the aftermath of the global financial crisis of 2008-2009, it was very strong import demand from China for commodities, but also for consumer and industrial goods that helped the global economy recover. Now, of course, the global economy is in a better position, but still there are many weaknesses out there, and many of the major economies are losing growth momentum. So if China continues its slide, that is certainly going to have some implications for the world economy, and especially for certain countries such as the commodity exporters that might face reduced demand, with one exception, of course, that is the commodity that everybody is talking about, including us, which is energy.
And well, China's coal producers, they've had their work cut out with limited supplies and growing demand. And a lot of countries around the world, including China, they've been looking to natural gas. And while the Chinese government, they ordered its state-owned companies, energy companies, to secure energy supplies for the winter at all costs. Is this going to trigger a bidding war for natural gas around the world?
Certainly, there is going to be a great deal of demand and potentially, and a little worry, of energy nationalism, because as you pointed out, there are many countries around the world where there are rising energy prices that are beginning to bite, especially on the more vulnerable parts of their populations. Here in the US, we've seen a significant uptick in prices at the fuel pump, and that's certainly not playing very well politically. There are potentially concerns that even the US might think about introducing limits on its exports of natural gas. I don't think that will happen. But the fact that we're talking about it, I think, is already pointing to the sort of concern every country has about ensuring that there's enough energy supplies, especially leading into the winter. And of course, there are some countries like Britain where they have brought some additional problems on themselves through problems with logistics related to the Brexit problems and the lack of truck drivers to take the existing fuel to where it is really needed. So I think this combination of supply shortages, rising demand, and logistics problems is all coming to a head at exactly the wrong time.
And do you think OPEC is going to increase production under this kind of pressure?
Now, certainly, that would be one response that would make things a lot easier. The difficulty here is that given the supply constraints that we face, especially the breakdown of many components of the supply chain, both domestically and around the world, ramping up supply may not really help that supply get to where it needs to get to. That is a real constraint. So you might be able to pull more oil out of the ground, but you need to get it to refineries, and then you need to get it through the distribution system to where it needs to go. And those are the parts of the supply chain that are not working very well. And once you start thinking about this from a global perspective, well, there are still enormous problems still in terms of global distribution of commodities, consumer goods, and a broad variety of products. And the supply of energy is not immune to these problems.
And it seems that the US hasn't been feeling the energy shortage as acutely as China and Europe, perhaps. But there have been inflationary fears, though. This crisis has been stoking fear that consumer prices are going to rise even more in the US, where there's already been sky-high inflation. What are your thoughts on this? Is this going to affect the Fed's speed of tapering as well?
The Fed has already been talking about the fact that what it had thought might be this transitory spike in inflation as we were coming off a very low base after the fall in prices in the aftermath of the COVID pandemic. That base effect, which would have led to a temporary spike in inflation, does not seem to be the key driver of inflation anymore. There seem to be some longer-term dynamics beginning to set in. And that is certainly a big concern for the Fed. For any central bank, losing control of the inflation expectations process is a very worrying matter. Now, the Fed has a new policy framework where it is willing to tolerate some degree of inflation for a certain period of time above its target of 2%. But if it looks like inflation is going to become entrenched in the economy, especially at a time of slowing growth, that is certainly a concern that the Fed will have to respond to. And if that results in the Fed tapering more quickly, potentially even raising interest rates, although the Fed has indicated it will not consider that till 2022, that will have an effect on South Korea and many other economies, because once you have the cost of dollar funding beginning to rise, that affects small open economies as well as developing countries around the world. So those ripple effects will be felt far and wide.
As you mentioned, many Asian countries have been rather nervous about the speed of tapering and the prospects regarding the raising of interest rates in the US. And while for some countries, the rise in demand for energy has provided quite profitable as domestic coal companies. They've done quite well in terms of share prices. And of course, over the weekend, we have the COP26 climate conference coming up. Do you think that for the time being, economic growth is going to remain coal-driven? And do you think there's going to be some tension between these newly industrialized countries and strong proponents of zero emissions at the COP26 summit?
Certainly at COP26, there are going to be a variety of competing interests at play, right? When countries around the world face weak growth momentum, the priority of all policymakers in the short run is really to focus on maintaining growth and supporting growth in every way possible. So what we're seeing in the lead up to COP26 is discussions about the future, about longer term objectives. The question is whether we're really going to see any action on the ground starting now. It is all very well to make commitments about substantially reducing carbon emissions, about taking other measures to protect the environment by 2030 and so on, but action really has to start now. And the reality is that right now it's a very difficult time to make a very sharp transition away from non-renewable to renewable energy sources. So I think in most major economies, there is a recognition that something has to be done about the problem of climate change. The question is about the timing, really. And I think there is going to be a significant disconnect between what policymakers are willing to promise for the long term and what they're willing to do in the short term. Because again, with rising energy prices, with the energy shortages, there is a drive to get energy from any source possible to the extent possible and to keep prices down. And that, I think, is a fundamental short-term priority, which is not necessarily well aligned with the longer-term priorities.
Right. Certainly the price volatility of energy and commodities is something that governments are going to have to be able to manage in the future. But for the time being, do you think power shortages and high energy costs leading to reduced industrial activities is going to intensify this very jagged recovery model, the K-shaped model in the world?
It's certainly going to generate some tensions on the ground in terms of economic policy. So I think any shift away from supporting the non-renewable energy sector, and in turn, the sort of support that the non-renewable energy sector can provide for industrial activity, there isn't going to be a concerted push in the short run, because right now, maintaining growth, trying to get economies back on track after the severe shock that hit the entire world economy last year and through into this year, I think that remains the key priority of policymakers. But at the same time, you can see that some countries like China are beginning to look to the future. The Biden administration is keen to start putting in place a number of measures that could potentially try to resolve this tension. So for instance, if you were to direct more subsidies towards the renewable energy sector, that could provide a bit of a short-term economic activity, while at the same time moving economies in the right direction in terms of environmental sustainability. So I think there are policy avenues to be able to reconcile the short-term and longer-term objectives. But this tension with the shorter-term priority of maintaining growth is going to be visible in every economy at every stage of the policy-making process.
Right, well, I'm afraid this is where we have to wrap up the interview today, but that was Ezra Prasad, Tulani Senior Professor of Trade Policy at Cornell University. Thank you so much for your insights today.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
The United States is urging China to help international efforts to denuclearize North Korea if it wants to see lasting peace and stability on the Korean Peninsula. Pentagon spokesperson John Kirby said Monday that Beijing has significant influence over the regime, adding this could be used as leverage to help the North make the right decision. He also pressed China to be more cooperative and helpful in regards to North Korea, which Kirby says is a mutually shared interest. His remarks follow a series of missile tests by North Korea and the regime's refusal to listen to US calls for dialogue. And South Korea's top nuclear envoy says that by declaring a formal end to the Korean War, other countries could show North Korea that they aren't harboring hostility against the regime. Currently, South Korea is engaging in high-level talks with the United States on this issue, first proposed by President Moon Jae-in. Our Yoon Jung-min has more on what needs to be considered.
Seoul's chief nuclear negotiator Do Gyu-duk says declaring a formal end to the 1950-53 Korean War is the best symbolic way to show there is no hostility toward the regime, and it could significantly add momentum to a resumption of talks. Speaking at a forum in Seoul on Monday, the diplomat noted that North Korea has been demanding the U.S. end what it calls a hostile policy as a precondition for talks since the 2019 Hanoi summit fell apart. He added that America's longest war is in fact the Korean War, not Afghanistan, because the Korean War ended in an armistice and 68 years later there has still not been a peace negotiation. In that sense, he said the end-of-war declaration is meaningful as a means to build trust with the North, and added that he had in-depth discussions on the issue with his U.S. counterpart Sung Kim on Sunday. Earlier, Kim told reporters he looks forward to exploring different ideas, including the proposal.
I look forward to continuing to work with Special Representative No to explore different ideas and initiatives, including the ROK's end-of-war proposal, as we continue to pursue our shared objectives on the peninsula.
North Korea responded to the proposal by the South last month, but as a precondition for ending the war, it demanded an end to, quote, double standards and the so-called hostile policy. Sources say South Korea and the U.S. are preparing an outline of the proposal for potential adoption, but the U.S. has not announced a specific stance on the issue or other details.
The U.S. can consider the possibility of moving with South Korea to work on an end-of-war declaration, but it is likely to be contingent on a lot of other factors, including how North Korea would respond and what this means for the alliance relationship.
Reports say the U.S. is carefully reviewing the potential impact of the proposal. In the meantime, experts say all the various factors and possible impact have to be considered if the declaration is to be adopted. Yoon Jung-min, Arirang News.
Now it's time for On Point, where we speak to experts to delve deeper into the biggest news stories in the spotlight right now. North Korea recently testified a new kind of submarine-launched ballistic missile. The US called the act destabilizing, but stopped short of labeling it an immediate threat to the region.
The launch came as top officials from South Korea, the US, and Japan were holding talks in Seoul on the nuclear standoff. For more on this, we connect to Mark Barry, a longtime North Korea expert and the associate editor of the International Journal of World Peace. Good morning.
Good morning.
Now, the national security chiefs of Seoul, Washington, and Tokyo were meeting on the same day as the test firing. In your view, was it a diplomatic or a military message the North wanted to send with the test firing of this SLBM?
Well, it's always a political message. Everything boils down to politics in a system like North Korea's. And so they launched their SLBM 2 days before South Korea tested its own space rocket, the Nuri. And more importantly, it was the SLBM was launched about 5 weeks after South Korea tested 5 different weapon systems. So really, North Korea is trying to say we're an equal Korea, and they're having a hard time keeping up, but it's for the sake of their sense of national pride and out of fear of being downtrodden in a political and diplomatic sense, they have to do these kinds of actions to look like they're still players. So really, every week for them, every month, is a matter of showing that we're still here and we're still viable, because they fear that the world is maybe having its doubts.
Now, as a follow-on to that then, the Biden administration has this strong diplomatic focus on Asia and in particular China. Hard for them not to at this point. How much weight do you put on the opinion the North's military moves are really aimed at getting Washington's attention, showing the US it shouldn't be primarily or very heavily focused on just trying to rein in the influence of Beijing?
Well, for a small state like North Korea to be ignored by the United States is akin to oblivion. The old shrimp among whales notion going back many, many generations with the Korean Peninsula. So North Korea recognizes that to them they are in an existential crisis, a word that I used a couple of weeks ago, that they're in a humiliating situation of dependency on one northern neighbor, and that situation can't continue. So they do these things to gain American attention, but what they're heading to, in my view, is something where they can do something in tandem down the road with South Korea that would involve leveraging the United States, but try to exclude its former patrons in both China and Russia.
Now, Mark, North Korea has long been known for copying the technology of other countries, as well as, hacking into other nations' systems to steal their blueprints. Are you concerned that with this SLBM launch, North Korea is at a point now where it can generate its own sophisticated missile technology?
They can steal, but they can't implement. They don't have the resource base. They don't have the widespread human capital. But what you have to watch out for is the fact that there are Russian and Chinese and Iranian and Pakistani scientists who, in a quasi-official capacity, may lend help and assistance. And that's, I think, what has enabled North Korea to get as far as it has. But they themselves will not be able to achieve the level of technology that South Korea has. But down the road, working in tandem with South Korea, that will be a very formidable force throughout East Asia.
And finally, looking at it through the eyes of the regime, North Korea is banned from firing any ballistic missiles and is scolded over and over again for doing so. That being said, do you think it's really hard for South Korea and the US to say they have this moral high ground when they both test sophisticated weapons and hold these huge joint military drills at least once a year right on North Korea's doorstep?
Well, North Korea has been a UN member, as South Korea has, for the last 30 years. But for the North, the last 15, they've been under extreme or heavily mounting UN Security Council sanctions. They accept the sanctions as a part of life. But I agree, I don't think anybody has the moral high ground, but the North conducts these missile tests just keeping under the range understandings that they had with President Trump to maintain U.S. attention and to leverage their way to become accepted as a modern state with the full range of defense capabilities so they can be taken seriously and negotiate from a position as an equal rather than a country that is seen as being in dire economic straits. However, the real rubber meets the road when the harvest of this fall runs out, possibly early this coming spring, and then North Korea attempts to feed its people with a harvest that may not be there, and we may see the second worst food crisis in the North's history, behind only that of 1996 to 97.
Okay, now, as always, we appreciate your insights on the matter. Mark Barry, Associate Editor of the International Journal of World Peace, with his analysis on North Korea. Thank you again.
Thank you.
Moving on now, the Japanese government has a long history of making false territorial claims to Dokdo, and the country's new Prime Minister, Fumio Kishida, is taking a tried and tested approach as the October 31st general election looms in Japan.
Despite that, a number of local experts believe that maintaining good relations with Tokyo will benefit South Korea more going forward than turning Dokdo into a major issue. Han Sung reports.
Analysts in South Korea say that for the time being, Japan, despite recently coming under new leadership, will continue to make false claims over Dokdo. Just a couple of weeks ago, Japan's ruling Liberal Democratic Party released its pledge booklet ahead of the general elections on October 31st, claiming again, as it did in 2017, that Dokdo belongs to Japan. This, along with several other hardline policies, came as a surprise to some in Japan, considering new Prime Minister Fumio Kishida's dovish reputation. But Dr. Lee Myeon-woo of the Sejong Institute believes it's a calculated move.
There's a need for the LDP to refrain from straying too far from its original position. The ruling party enjoys support from conservatives, so it probably had no choice but to include its territorial claim toward Dokdo in its booklet.
As such, experts predict Tokyo won't be too aggressive about it. They say Japan will have to take into account a third party in the United States, who would not favor the islets becoming a hotly contested issue.
For Washington, the Korea-US-Japan alliance is crucial in dealing with China. The three, as a trio, share a strong relationship, but Korea and Japan as a pair do not. Tensions just keep rising between the two.
Dr. Yi says the same applies for Korea, who don't have anything to gain from sovereignty over Dokdo becoming an international conflict.
We're the ones occupying Dokdo, the islets, are ours, so there's no reason for us to take Dokdo to the International Court of Justice. If we do, who knows what could happen? It's not wise on our part to make it into a conflict.
Korea has been in effective control of Dokdo since its liberation from Japanese colonial rule in 1945. 한성우, Arirang News.
There has been a change of plans regarding South Korea's ASEAN-related summits to be held online for 2 days from Tuesday. The Blue House on Monday postponed the Korea-Mekong summit, originally scheduled for Tuesday evening, with the leaders of Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, Thailand, and Myanmar. A senior official said the summit will be held later due to internal circumstances in the Mekong River nations. The official did not specify what the circumstances are, but local media outlets cited that the Blue House is saying it was most likely due to the situation in Myanmar. Along with other ASEAN countries, South Korea has expressed concern over the military's takeover in Myanmar, calling for peace and diplomacy. The World Food Programme is warning tens of millions of Afghans, including children, could die of starvation unless urgent action is taken, calling for frozen funds to be released without delay for humanitarian efforts. Now, speaking to Reuters on Monday, the agency's chief, David Beasley, said 22.8 million people, or more than half of Afghans' entire population, are facing an acute food crisis. The figure is higher than the 14 million reported 2 months ago, before the Taliban takeover, which in turn prompted donors to hold back billions of dollars in assistance. The UN Food Agency says $220 million would be needed as winter nears.
South Korea will host the 26th meeting of the Association of National Olympic Committees next year, also known as the General Assembly for the Olympics. The association brings together over 200 national Olympic committees, including key IOC members. The Korean Sport Olympic Committee on Monday said Seoul will host the event on October 19th and 20th, 2022. South Korea was originally chosen to host the 25th meeting last November, but that was postponed in light of the pandemic, later relocated to Greece. South Korea has previously hosted the meetings in 1986 and 2006. On Monday morning, subscribers to internet and mobile services provided by KT Corporation found their phone data and home internet not working for around 40 minutes, starting at 11:20 a.m. local time. It affected payment systems, which inconvenienced restaurants during the lunch hour rush, not to mention causing problems on the Korea Exchange, disrupting online classes for students, and even hospitals. According to KT, one of South Korea's big three telecom providers, the outage was caused by an error in their network. When it was reported, cybercrime investigators were immediately dispatched to KT's HQ. Dementia, unfortunately, affects 1 in 10 people in South Korea who are 65 or older. There's an even increased risk now as the pandemic has made people less active. But will there ever be a cure to this dreadful medical condition? Chang Tae-hyun reports.
Dementia degrades a person's cognitive ability, meaning that they can no longer recognize the time, place, and even the people that they used to know. According to the National Institute of Dementia, the disease affects 830,000 people in South Korea. That's roughly 1 in 10 people aged 65 and above. Having dementia is not just being forgetful. Rather than thinking, oh, I forgot to have lunch, dementia patients don't even realize that they forgot to have lunch.
Dementia is an acquired disease which causes memory, language, and judgmental abilities to deteriorate. Alzheimer's disease accounts for more than 70% of dementia cases, but there are other types, including vascular, alcoholic, and Parkinson's dementia.
She added that it's important to know the reason for weaker cognitive and language abilities, because those with vascular dementia can recover if they lower their cholesterol and blood pressure. But Alzheimer's requires a different treatment. As of now, there are 5 FDA-approved treatments. 4 of them alleviate the symptoms but don't address the main cause. So the medication can help for about a year but becomes less effective over time. The other treatment got conditional approval from the FDA in June and treats the actual cause of Alzheimer's. The drug developed by U.S. pharmaceutical company Biogen is the world's first to treat the cause of dementia, although its effectiveness is not yet fully proven. South Korea is also working on a cure.
We're supporting projects ranging from deriving clinical candidates to non-clinical, phase 1 and phase 2 clinical trials. As far as I know, there are more than 3 clinical trials that are underway after receiving approval from the country's Ministry of Food and Drug Safety. All of them are to treat the cause. It's known that there are various causes, and as there's only one treatment that's been approved by the FDA, there will be international competition.
Many facilities for older people have been closed recently due to COVID-19, and without social activities, the elderly are more prone to dementia. These are some of the main symptoms of dementia: forgetting how to get back home or asking the same question over and over again. Pay close attention to parents and friends and visit the hospital if there are any signs. 장태현, Arirang News.
The Seoul International Travel Mart kicks off Tuesday in the South Korean capital. The event aims to show off the city's most appealing tourist packages in the beauty, medical, and wellness fields. It also provides opportunities for startups and overseas buyers looking to tap into the local tourism market. The event will be held both online and offline at Sebitsam Island on Han River. There will also be a makeup show and a hanbok fashion show. If you can't make it, you can watch it live on the virtual Seoul platform.
Let's take a look at what's going on in the world now. For the second day in a row, fierce storms ravaged southern Italy on Monday, killing at least one person while triggering landslides and leaving roads and fields flooded. According to emergency services, the body of a 67-year-old man was recovered from a citrus grove far from where he was last seen after his car got hit by rising waters and mud. Authorities say his wife is still missing. According to the country's weather officials, parts of Sicily and Calabria were slammed by a rare Mediterranean hurricane known as Medicane, with winds of up to 120 kilometers per hour predicted. On Sunday, as much as 300 millimeters of rain fell near Catania in just a span of few hours, nearly half of the average annual rainfall on the Mediterranean island. The strong hurricane prompted schools to be closed in a number of towns and cities, while dozens of flights were diverted from the area, with ferry links between the southern islands forced to be cancelled. Speaking to the British Parliament on Monday, Facebook whistleblower Frances Haugen says Facebook will fuel more episodes of violent unrest around the world due to the way its algorithms are designed to promote divisive content.
One of the things that happens in aggregate is the algorithms take people who have very mainstream interests and they push them towards extreme interests. You can be someone center left and you'll get pushed to radical left. You can be center right, you'll get pushed to radical right.
The former product manager on Facebook's civic misinformation team said the social media giant saw safety as a cost center, lionizing a startup culture where cutting corners was a good thing, while it was making hate worse. Her comments come as Facebook CEO Mark Zuckerberg earlier this month slammed accusations that the company deliberately pushes content that makes people angry for profit, calling it illogical. Documents released to the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission and the Congress by Haugen showed that Facebook hadn't hired enough workers who possessed both the language skills and knowledge of local events needed to identify questionable posts from users in a number of developing countries, alleging such actions amplify extremely divisive and polarizing content. Nigeria became the first African country on Monday to launch a digital currency known as the e-Naira. The country's leaders say the move will expand access to banking, enable more remittances, and could grow the economy by billions of dollars. However, both experts and cryptocurrency users in the country say there are more questions than answers regarding the digital currency, noting that a large amount of worry stems over the consistency of its central bank's rules, meaning the government now faces a tough path to make the e-Naira a success. So far, $487,000 in e-Naira have been issued to financial institutions. Nigeria now joins the Bahamas, who are the first to launch a general-purpose central bank digital currency known as the sand dollar. However, China currently has ongoing trials, while Switzerland and the Bank of France have announced Europe's first cross-border experiment. Lee Seung-jae, Arirang News.
Good morning. Well, aren't we so glad to see the fine autumn back on track? And it looks to be another promising day under sunny skies, as long as you're aware of wide gaps of over 10 degrees Celsius, and it's going to be a warmer afternoon here in the capital. But fine dust levels could be high in southern Gyeonggi-do, Chungcheong-do, and Jeollabuk-do provinces during the first half of the day. Low temperatures are similar to yesterday under sunny skies with some fog in inland areas, and mountainous regions are having sub-zero morning temperatures with some frost. Then the afternoon will be slightly warmer than yesterday, so going up to 19 degrees, Busan will hike to 22, but more clouds can be rolling in as the day goes on. Central regions will see some spotty morning rain tomorrow with less than 5 millimeters in the forecast. With that, here's a look at the weather conditions around the world.
And that's all we have for today. Thank you for watching, and we'll be back at the same time on Wednesday, 8 a.m. Korea time with New Day at Arirang. I'm Kim Mo-gyan.
And I'm Mark Broom. I'll be back in just over 1 hour's time for our next newscast. That's 10 a.m. Korea time. But in the meantime, stay tuned to Arirang TV, and we'll see you at the same time tomorrow. Goodbye.